Please be seated. To an 8-year-old, summer can seem endless. In the South, where I grew up, summers were long and hot. They were filled to the brim with thunderstorms and fireflies, Queen Anne's lace, swimming along muddy rivers. For me, it was a bounty of freedom that seemed like it would never end. Summer is wonderful for 8-year-olds, but not perhaps as wonderful for their mothers. And so during those long, hot summers, my parents would inevitably try and get rid of me in some fashion or another. Even out in the country where we lived, an 8-year-old boy can take up a lot of space. Sometimes it was summer camp, other times it was vacation Bible school. It's not that I minded vacation Bible school, but in my way of thinking, it combined two words that seemed diametrically opposed to one another: vacation and school. Vacation meant long days exploring the woods with my dog, afternoons swimming in the river, building forts from sticks and stones. School meant something else entirely. And so it was with great trepidation that I set foot into the fellowship hall of that Presbyterian church near my house to take part in this vacation Bible school. Dozens of kids corralled into a room to sing songs in major keys and make pictures from dried pasta and hopefully learn something from those kind, enthusiastic teachers. One of these teachers, who was a bit more passionate and idealistic than even the most fervent of his colleagues, gathered us 8-year-olds in the hot July dusk one evening outside the fellowship hall, and we sat in the grass and we tied long green blades into knots, listened to the dull roar of the cicadas, and he gave us an assignment. We were told that we must learn a Bible verse to recite by heart at the end of the week. There was some grumbling from the audience, this being the part that sounded more like school than vacation. One boy raised his hand in the back. "Yes?" the teacher asked. "Can it be any Bible verse?" the boy asked, no doubt planning some act of subversion. "Yes," the teacher said, "any Bible verse." "Well, any Bible verse except John 11:35. Any Bible verse except John 11:35? Well, that was interesting. That was intriguing. What was this, a forbidden Bible verse? What could it be? What horrible, scandalous thing could that text say that would get it banned from vacation Bible school? At home that night, I furtively stole a family Bible from the bookshelf as if it contained something my parents wouldn't want me to read. What was this verse that couldn't be memorized? I turned the pages quickly with building anticipation. John 11:35. I found it. Jesus wept. Jesus wept. That was it. As much as I'd hoped for something thrilling, that was all that it gave me. Jesus wept, or Jesus began to weep, as it appears in your lectionary today. It was banned not because of being something scandalous, although perhaps it actually is, we'll return to that in just a moment, but because it was so short. Too short, as it turned out, to really count as something to memorize. The shortest verse, in fact, in the entire Bible. So let's just spend a moment with this, the shortest verse in the Bible. What do you make of it? Jesus is at the grave of his friend Lazarus, and some of his followers, even his closest confidants and disciples, are upset with him for, in their view, allowing Lazarus to die. How could Jesus, the greatest healer that any of them had ever known, not intervene, not stop Lazarus from dying? In fact, Martha's words to him are the most harsh. Her own grief masked in anger. "Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died." And in the midst of this crowd of mourners next to the grave of his friend, Jesus does something simple, human, but incredibly remarkable. He does what almost anyone would do when faced with suffering or loss or pain. He weeps. And here's the interesting thing, folks. Even though I didn't understand this as a child, even though I was looking for something different, those tears, it turns out, are really among the most scandalous things in all of Scripture. Those tears are powerful, history-changing things. Those tears are heretical and dangerous. And what's more, those tears give us a window into the heart of God. See, those tears are a metaphor for me for a big theological problem. Because those tears say something about the nature of God. You see, it's recorded in the book of Exodus that God tells Moses, "You cannot see my face, for no one can look upon me and live." And so God hides Moses in the cleft of a rock so the divine presence can pass by where he will be shielded from God's glory. The prophet Isaiah says that God is the high and lofty one who inhabits eternity, a presence that is beyond our understanding, beyond even the capability of our understanding. The psalmist says that the mountains melt like wax before the Lord of all the earth. The very earth trembles at his voice. To the people of Jesus' time, the power and the might and the majesty of God were unassailable, they were invincible, and they were fearful. And yet the disciples began to see that the rabbi who had led them was something almost unthinkable. God incarnate, God made into human flesh. The early Christians proclaimed that their God had lived with them, and then, most appalling of all, had died as a criminal on a cross. What could be a greater heresy, folks? What could be more appalling than to claim that the high and lofty one who inhabits eternity had been brought so miserably low to live with sinners and to die beside thieves? What could be a greater heresy? What could be more shocking than to say that the one whom we cannot look upon and live, whose eyes melt the mountains like wax, that those eyes would shed tears by the grave of a friend? That the one through whom all things were made, the one in whom we live and move and have our being, would kneel down into the mud of this world and suffer with it as all humans do, would die for it. Just imagine that scene outside of Lazarus' tomb. In John's telling of the scene, Jesus is both weak and human, divine and powerful. I am the resurrection and the life, Jesus says. And yet even the one who is the life of the world cannot help but weep at the tomb of his friend, a man he is about to bring back from the dead as a sign of that divine life that courses through him. How could it be that God, the creator of heaven and earth, could be moved to tears like a mourner at a funeral in a country church? How could it be that Yahweh Sabaoth, the Lord of hosts, the destroyer of the enemies of Israel, the inspiration of the prophets, the benefactor of the patriarchs, the one beyond and above all things, could also be a man who wept? The thing is, if you believe in God, it seems to diminish God's power and God's glory. It reduces God to something that can be understood in human terms and known by human ways. And if you don't believe in God, it seems like the greatest absurdity, just another silly joke in a string of crazy things that Christians have said. To say that God could be fully human and also remain God is illogical and absurd, the most appalling kind of gibberish. It's not a great stretch to say that the most basic foundation of Christian theology is also some of the hardest for us to understand. And yet it's also not so easy to dismiss. Because for those who met this man, there was something in those weeping eyes. There was something in the way that he held his head. There was something about those rough hands. Something that was not only life and health, but all life and all health. Something that could not be denied in spite of the madness in proclaiming it. And yet, despite the foolishness of following a crucified God, the early Christians spread their faith with blinding speed against all the obstacles that the powers that be, the powers of sin and decay and death, could throw against it. Against oppression and torture and fear of privation, it still spread, in spite of or even because of the way that it changed their lives. And that really is the point, isn't it? That he changes lives. That the one who cried by the tomb of his friend, that one brings hope, drives out fear. That he brings life where otherwise there would be only death. That was the experience of the early disciples. What was revealed in those tears was that God is not just the high and lofty one who inhabits eternity, not just the power of creation and destruction, but that God was as close to us as our very selves, as close to us as our friends and our family, as close to us as the one who weeps beside a grave. That God could cry, it may have been heresy, it may have been blasphemy, it may have been madness to those who heard it, but it was also real to those who saw it, to those who experienced it, to those who looked upon those eyes, on the one who calls to us and calls us to life abundantly, just as surely as he called Lazarus. We don't have the privilege of seeing Lazarus at the tomb. We weren't there. And there are precious few moments in life to witness resurrection. And yet we also inherit that good news of those who did see it. That Lazarus stepped out of the tomb, we have to take on faith. But what is not faith, what is fact, is that our lives are richer and better and fuller and more spirit-led. They are redeemed and uplifted and healed by that one who wept. The God who stepped into our story to make it his story. The story of the Christ. The one who became like us, that we might know and become like God. Holy One, in this place, on this day, we ask you to pour out your Spirit and your presence, that those who are seeking you might find you and might know you and your incredible and all-encompassing love. In your holy name.